Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and under new ownership since 2020, Moose sells a wide selection of comics from every publisher and time period, along with action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. We reference the television series Smallville a lot around here, and there's one Smallville rewatch podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring tremendous insight, passion, and humor as they discuss each and every episode of the series that ushered in the renaissance of superhero TV. Listen to Always Hold On to Smallville wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On to banner, including Arrow, DC's Legends of Tomorrow, Superman and Lois, and Star Wars. In the 1950s, George Reeves embodied the Man of Steel in Superman's first television adaptation. From its gritty black and white beginnings to the kid-friendly color years, to this day, an entire generation reveres George as their Superman, while for others, the show remains an overlooked chapter in the character's mythology. On this podcast, we bring everyone together as we break down each episode of Adventures of Superman. Welcome to another exciting episode in the Adventures of Superman. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss Season 2, Episode 15, My Friend Superman, is returning guest Gene Cahill. Welcome back.
Thank you very much. Excited to be here, Anthony.
Yeah, glad to have you back. Let's dive right in here. So, My Friend Superman, December 26th, 1953, written by David Chandler, directed by Tommy Carr. I'll read my synopsis, and then I'll ask for your overall impressions, and we'll go through it all as we typically do. Diner operator Tony is a self-proclaimed personal friend of Superman and the latest victim of a notorious protection racket. In a gambit to send Superman on a wild goose chase and steal evidence from the Daily Planet during his absence, the racketeers take advantage of Tony's possible connection to Superman by feeding him bogus info about a planned kidnapping of Lois Lane. The truth is revealed when Tony records the racketeers and Superman's super hearing deciphers their ruse. In the end, the diner crew pelts the racketeers with food, and Superman humors Tony in front of everyone, leading a former doubter to declare, well, I'll be darned, he really does know Superman. So that's our roadmap for this episode here. Let me toss it to you. Overall impressions of this, and as we discussed last time, you're a longtime veteran, old school fan of the George Reeves show. So I'm curious, overall impressions, and how, if at all, have your impressions of this episode changed over the years?
I enjoyed it. It was very silly in parts, but it was also very serious in parts. I always love when we see Clark as the crusading investigative reporter. That's a great role that the Adventures of Superman allowed Clark to be like the best Clark for me. He's not like the bumbling sort of silly version of Clark that you often see. He's like a man that the crooks are afraid of him. He's got, as the one crook says, a hot typewriter. So, which was a really interesting way of putting it. But, and I have never, I had forgotten a lot about this episode because I haven't seen it in a while, but it ending in like a 1930s/40s pie fight in the diner was just hysterical to me. It was one of the weirdest endings of any episode of Superman I can remember.
Let's start with that, because you and I have both spent our fair share of time in comic shops on both sides of the counter. And as Tony, the operator of this diner, was just wrecking his own place, throwing this food all about, to me, it's like if a comic shop retailer started ripping up their comics. It's like, yes, it made for a humorous ending, but I just kept thinking, this is your place. But I guess it was cathartic after everything he had been through, and it was a small price to pay compared to what he had been paying and would be continuing to pay if these racketeers hadn't been busted. But again, the former comic shop employee in me came alive during that scene. I'm like, no, stop.
I felt the same way. I'm thinking, oh my God, look at the mess you're making in your diner. Who's going to clean this up? I'm thinking of his poor daughter having to clean up like pie all over the walls.
Yeah, I agree with your assessment. This was a sillier one. This was not my favorite. I think there is a charm to it that comes through via Tony himself and the kindness and compassion that both Clark and Superman show Tony. Like, Tony clearly is telling these tall tales about knowing Superman. And for either Clark or Superman, it'd be really easy to kind of put him in his place, so to speak, and disabuse him of this notion that he's been perpetuating. But he doesn't do that, and rather humors him. And again, I think that shows the kinder side of the character. I think for me, this episode needed at least one more turn at some point. It started to feel a little bit tedious to me. I won't lie, over the 20-ish minute runtime. But the biggest problem I had was... Actually, let me ask you this question. What is your read on Tony? Has Tony ever had any interaction with Superman prior to the end of the episode? Or are these all just entirely fabricated stories?
I'm under the impression they're all fabricated stories. That he's just, I think at the beginning, he's trying to see if he can intimidate the gangsters a little bit with his, quote, knowledge of Superman and his, that he knows Superman, hoping maybe they'll back off. But of course, they don't fall for it at all.
Right.
But yeah,
I agree with that. And I think that comes through in Clark's interactions with him. And then especially, I feel like if there were any doubt, when you get to the final moments, which we'll get to in our discussion, but Tony starts to apologize to Superman at the end, and Superman stops him. And he has a remark about, oh, I've got another recipe for you. Because that's one of the things that Tony claims, right? Tony has a number of claims. There's a gun on the wall with a bent barrel. He claims that Superman bent it. He has numerous recipes for the Super Burger and Super Soup. And he claims they come from Superman. Other instances where he claims he tipped off Superman and helped him in his adventures. And so, yes, I do think it's clear. I do think the intention of the episode is that none of these are true. He's made them all up. They're all tall tales, which is fine. But I guess... the one tweak I would have made, and yes, it's easy for me to Monday morning quarterback this decades later, but the one tweak I would have made, rather than have him be an outright liar, why not make him an exaggerator? Like, it would have made more sense to me in this episode if he had at least once, however fleeting, some kind of interaction with Superman that now he's kind of extrapolated this whole relationship from. Not that he's insane, but like, some sort of interaction. Maybe Superman thanks him for something. And in his mind now, it's like, oh yeah, he's my friend. And we had this moment, and he builds out from there, as opposed to just like making it all up. I have sympathy for Tony. I think he's an endearing character, the little Italian diner owner, the very heavy accent. But I don't know. My sympathy for him only goes so far because he's just making all this up.
One thing they never really resolve is, where did the rifle come from? Obviously, was that, I kind of got the impression that Superman had legitimately bent that rifle at some point, but they never explain where if he got it from someone, where that rifle came from, because it plays so much into like the plot, but there's never an explanation for it, which I thought was a bit odd.
I agree. I think it's George, the doubting customer, who says, oh, how'd you do that? Did you put it in a vice? Or so, I think that's the speculation. So maybe it was that. If it were Superman, I assume Tony just found it on the street or something after Superman had done something. Not that they had any interaction, but yeah, you're right. We never get a crystal clear answer on that. So maybe that was something that had been touched by Superman prior to its original hanging on the wall. But yeah, I still don't get the sense that they ever had a true interaction. And I don't know. I just think I rooted for Tony enough as it was, but I feel like I would have been more on the side of that character had there been something there, some little seed of a friendship that then kind of blossomed in his mind, as opposed to something that he was just making up.
I understand exactly what you're saying. Yes.
So that was a little bit of a roadblock for me. I won't lie, but it was still an entertaining enough episode. The one other thing though, that really jumped out at me was early on in the episode, we get Superman's arrival at the Daily Planet, and he types up his story on he types up Clark's story on the typewriter while still dressed as Superman, which, and Gene and audience, correct me if I'm wrong, we've never seen before, and does it at super speed, which again, correct me if I'm wrong, we have not seen super speed before on the show.
No, I thought that was really interesting. I thought that was really, really interesting the way they did that, because you're right. I don't remember ever seeing him do Clark's role as Superman and him like leaping in, onto the ledge, jumping in, grabbing the paper, sitting down, like typing at super speed, and then coming out to like deliver the hot story to Perry. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, right off that hot typewriter, as you said. But yeah, no, just the visual of him, the visual of Superman at the typewriter in and of itself is amazing. And that's one of those images you kind of see floating around on social media, because it is quite striking in and of itself, and especially in the context of the show, where typically you don't have that crossing of the two worlds in that way. And then, yeah, to see the footage sped up, so you see him doing this at super speed, because on all these episodes, whenever he's running after someone, he's like running at normal human speed. So it was quite striking. I enjoyed that.
Yeah, I did too, very much.
Any other overall impressions before we get more specific?
Not really too much. I mean, it seemed like a fairly like middle of the road episode. I enjoyed it. It was like we both agree, it was a little silly, but I definitely enjoyed it. A lot of these episodes, I haven't seen them specifically in a long time, because you kind of tend to watch your favorites. Like, I can't watch Panic in the Sky enough times, truthfully. So, or the first one, which I just love the first one, but this was a lot of fun. It's definitely something I don't think you could get away nowadays with having such a sort of stereotypical Italian character with the accent and everything.
Yeah, it's a bit on the nose for sure.
Yeah,
I agree. I think you probably get a more nuanced depiction of him now. But in any event, as far as our guest cast here, I'll just run them down real quick. And anything you want to share about any of these guest actors, please feel free. But we had Tito Vuolo as Tony, Yvette Duguay as Elaine, Paul Burke as Ace, Terry Frost as Spud, Joseph Vitale as Cap, Ralph Sanford as George, and a young Ruta Lee as Claire, one of the dancing teenagers at the end there. Anything that jumps out up to you about any of our guest actors in this episode?
No, I thought that Ralph Sanford, who played the guy at the counter, was really good. Him, the doubting Thomas. I looked up all these actors on IMDb to sort of get a little background on them. I did not realize that was Ruta Lee until I saw that she was going by her pre-actress name in the credits. But I guess Ralph Sanford, he was like a comic foil all the way back to the 1930s for like Shemp Howard, Fatty Arbuckle. It was pretty amazing. A lot of these people, that's the thing that always impresses me about Adventures of Superman, is a lot of these people have such amazing like acting resumes. And you look at what they did before and after, and a lot of these folks were just jobbing actors that did like tons of 50s TV and films in the 40s. And it's just very impressive seeing some of these people's resumes. It definitely, and Ruta Lee became such sort of a ubiquitous, she was everywhere at a certain point. And it's just so funny to see her in probably what was one of the earliest things she ever did as the dancer.
Yeah, that was quite the scene when we get to the dance. Oh, I guess one other big picture thing, I could save it for our scene by scene, but I'll say it now because I really did enjoy this. I wish this had gotten more play. I wanted one more beat of Jimmy and Elaine, the daughter, as I thought that was cute. And I just wanted some sort of button to that where he's so flustered when he and Clark first go to the diner and he's talking to her and he just is jumbling his words. He can't get them out. Now, I do have to say, though, something jumped out at me about that. I feel like Clark could have actually been a wingman in that instance instead of calling Jim out for being flustered. I mean, he literally says, like, oh, Jim, you seem pretty flustered. It's like, why don't you help this guy out? Tee him up for something. I felt like as the big brother type character, and especially this Clark of this show, he's, he knows the Tip Top Club in Metropolis. Like, this guy's a man about town. He knows what's what. I feel like he could have helped his little pal there. And I thought he dropped the ball, but I like that. And then later on when Jim is clearly trying to ask Elaine out to the movie or whatever it was. And then he just wimps out and he asks for a glass of milk instead. And this poor girl, she's like, yes, sir, here's your milk.
She's obviously so ready to be asked out by him. So ready. This has probably been going on like for months, that we've never seen. He's probably been in there a million times trying to ask her out and just never quite gets the courage to do so.
I know. Yeah, she was clearly, like you said, she was ready for him to ask. I feel like she was a moment away from just finishing the sentence for him, but they didn't get there. And it's, yeah, you feel bad for the two of them. But, and then there's another moment where Jim is looking at those two dancers at the end and he's like, oh, what it must be like to be young. And she gives him a look. So, yeah, there's definitely some fun stuff in this one. I also, you know what, I do like the setting. The fact that this is this diner right by the Daily Planet. Like, this is their regular haunt. This is where they go, right, before work, for lunch, during work, after work. Like, this is their regular spot, and Tony knows them. I like that, just kind of adding to the color of their life in Metropolis. So I thought that was cool, too.
Yeah, me too. I thought it was very interesting. I'm surprised that we didn't see these characters again, because it seems like it would have been a nice little setup for maybe some sort of later story. But
it's one of these things. This comes up often in these discussions where I and the guests, I think we all recognize that TV now is so serialized in a way that it never was before, and it was far more episodic. And I get that, and I appreciate that. At the same time, what's always a little funny to me about this show in particular is that you have so many actors, mentioning our great supporting players. You have so many actors on Adventures of Superman coming back multiple times, but always playing different characters. And so I just say to myself, it's like, oh, if you ever brought someone back like as the same character sometime, you would just kind of create that continuity, not in a way that requires you to have seen the other episode. Because I know that's a big part of this, right? Like, it airs and you might miss it and that's it. So you can't rely on people having seen it. I get it. But it's like, even if prior viewing isn't required, but at least for those who have seen it, it's like, oh, like that person's back. So it just feels like they could have done that in numerous instances, but they chose not to. It is what it is.
I think a lot of it too, Anthony, was like the nature of TV in those days, because people really didn't like. I remember, not to jump tracks, but there was. I've been doing a rewatch of classic Star Trek, and there were a couple people that were extras on that show that didn't have speaking lines, that would show up multiple times. They'd be different characters in different episodes. One episode, one of the extras was the character was killed, and then the next episode he came back as a different character. But I think that they didn't really look at television in those days as something that was like a continuous thing that people would watch the whole run of,
Yeah.
So they figured out, nobody's going to care. Nobody's going to remember this. Not knowing that years later, people like you and me would be analyzing these with, with a magnifying glass and looking at all the nuances.
I appreciate that. And I totally agree. I think that certainly accounts for it, but it just always kind of jumps out. All right. Shall we go through our little scene by scene discussion here? However much we have to say. I know we've already hit on a fair amount as it is, but we open on the diner here with Tony, his daughter Elaine, and this regular customer, George, who's just perpetually at the counter all day, it seems. And so our two racketeers, Ace and Spud, come in, and Elaine mentions to Tony, like, oh, those are the guys who are looking for you. So he's kind of resigned. He goes over to them. They ask if he has it. He does. He hands over this envelope full of cash. And he tells them, you'll be sorry, because he's a personal friend of Superman. And to prove it, as we had mentioned before, he goes over to the wall where you have this rifle with the bent barrel, and he brings it over and claims that this was done by Superman and given to him. And even again, in this earliest scene, we have that exchange between Elaine and George to the effect of Tony starting to believe it himself, right? So right from the jump, you get the sense that this is not the truth, but this is kind of the reality that Tony lives in here. So anything stand out to you about this that we didn't talk about?
No, not really. I thought, like I said before, I think he's trying to use a rifle load to intimidate those guys, and they're just not going for it at all.
Right.
They obviously think that Tony is as big a liar as the guy at the counter. Well, exaggerator as the guy at the counter does. So
Yeah.
There's obviously everybody has the impression that Tony is just pulling everybody's leg.
I mean, it's interesting that the Racketeers, though, they will get to the point where they put enough stock in Tony where they're like, oh, he might be Superman's contact. But yeah, certainly at this point, I agree. I don't think they see that yet. And, there's a remark about essentially conveying the fact that this is protection money. He won't have to worry about his windows getting busted now. Right. So your typical protection racket here, which we'll come to find as part of this series of articles that Clark is writing and that Lois is working on as well. So the Daily Planet is working to expose this protection racket, which is growing in the city. But this is our first introduction to it. And then we get this appearance of Superman that we were talking about before. Before he even arrives in Clark's office and types up the story as Superman at super speed, like we said, it's a long flight home. I mean, he's flying over mountains and oceans. I mean, I wonder where he's coming from. Was he visiting his best friend, Colonel Redding, over in Germany or wherever it was? I mean, it's like, where was he coming from?
Could have been, I was thinking that too. I mean, he could have been, who knows, like dealing with a hurricane or a volcano or something overseas. We never know what he's up to between episodes. So
I don't want to say that's the most fascinating aspect, because the episodes that we see, that is what I enjoy the most. But I remain so intrigued by what this man gets up to in between. So he changes back to Clark at last after he finishes his story, and he passes by Lois in the hallway there, and she's off on a trip. She's got her suitcase packed. She's about to get on the elevator. Won't say where she's going. So they have this very brief interaction in the hallway there. And then Clark makes his way to Perry's office. Jim intercepts and lets him know that Perry's upset, as per usual. Perry is quite surprised that Clark had the time to write this story. And Clark has a line about, being fast on his typewriter when he needs to be, or something to that effect. I love how Perry just grabs and crumples the article that Clark has, this multi-page article. And by the time they walk into the office, he's like, this looks good, Ken. It works fast, man. Perry, as fast as Clark types, that's how fast Perry edits and approves these stories. He's like, it's great.
One thing I do think is interesting. Lois mentions the fact that she's leaving because she has an angle on the protection racket, but we never find out where she was or what she did. She just shows up at the diner later. I mean, I hate to jump ahead, but
that's fine.
She shows up at the diner later, like she never went anywhere. She never mentions what she did. She never mentions the story, but she just comes in at the end, and it's like they dropped the whole idea that she was on a investigative reporting trip. I thought that was odd.
I agree with you, and I'm glad you brought this up. So I don't seem too nitpicky, but I'm going to jump on it now. Because no, I agree. So much of this story ends up hinging on the fact that no one knows where Lois is. Right. That's what the Racketeers take advantage of, because they overhear, we'll get to it, but they overhear Clark saying at the diner, oh, we don't know where Lois went. So they use this to kind of plant this false information about the kidnapping and send Superman on this wild goose chase, where if they all knew where Lois was, Superman could easily fly to her and grab her, and then it's fine. So the fact that we never get an explanation is one thing, but the idea that Lois wouldn't tell Perry, at least, where she was going. Now, you might argue oh, well, it's Lois Lane, she just runs off, but I don't know. Clearly there was thought and preparation involved here. The idea that she's in the office, she's packing her bag, she's telling them that she's leaving, and she's telling them which story she's leaving for, but she refuses to say where. I don't know. That felt like a stretch to me, even for Lois.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, again, it has to happen so that the rest of the plot will work later. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like it should have just been, I don't know, man. It should have been that she was already on an assignment, and then, I don't know, something else came up and she could only get a quick message or something like that. It just, I don't know that totally tracked the way it played.
I agree 100%. Yep. It just seemed like to come out of nowhere.
Yeah. But in any event, we got this information. She's off. She's also working on this protection racket story. I mean, not to pick this apart totally, but I also wonder, this is a racket based in the city. I mean, that's not to say that it doesn't have tentacles in other cities, or that it doesn't originate somewhere else, but it seems to really be in Metropolis. So it's where is she going to investigate this? Well, you never know.
No.
All right, so we're back at the diner now. Jim and Clark enter. This is where we get this bit of business where you have Ace and Spud. They're still in their booth. They're talking about Clark, like you said, in his hot typewriter. He writes all these articles that puts the bad guys away. So, he's, they're no fan of Clark Kent. We also get Jim and his flustered exchange with Elaine here. This is also where the Racketeers clock it when, Tony asks, where's Lois? And Clark's like, nobody knows. And this is where Tony, again, continues to spin these yarns about his friendship with Superman, how he tipped Superman off in numerous instances. Superman caught someone, right, who fell off of a building right outside because Tony tipped him off, like multiple instances of this. And this is where, too, the Racketeers are taking note of Tony's stories. And this is where the wheels are turning, where it's like, it seems like he believes this, like maybe there's something to it. Whatever you want to say about that scene, and I guess in particular, I don't know, the way Clark regards Tony during all of this. I don't know. I guess what was your reaction to it?
I think he seemed like he had just bemused tolerance for Tony's stories. Like he wasn't disagreeing with him. He was almost jokingly playing along with him. So obviously he likes Tony a lot. I mean, probably everybody likes Tony. He's the guy that they all go to his diner, and he doesn't want to embarrass him or make him feel like, he's a liar. So Clark seems like he just wants to humor him in a polite way.
I agree with that. And I think it's a testament to the performance of George Reeves, because I feel like this could read as condescending or patronizing. And I don't think it does. I think it does read more as he's humoring him. He's showing some kindness. He's not blowing up this guy's spot the way he does to Jim when he calls him out for being flustered. Right. But again, I feel like in a lesser performer's hands, it might not play quite as good-naturedly as it does here. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations: Harrison, New York, aka my local comic shop, Skokie, Illinois, or Muncie, Indiana. If you have kids and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw Yeah. Filmmakers and movie fans alike should be sure to attend these film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and Round Reel in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Take it from an alum of 2 of them. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. Creator and podcaster Perry Constantine, host of Superhero Cinephiles, has a special offer for listeners of this podcast. Visit percivalconstantine.com/DFK or click the link in the show notes. Fill out the form and then get 2 free novels and 1 free superhero short story. The novels are Vanguard, Heroes Forged, an Avengers-inspired team of superheroes, and Ronin Born, a cyberpunk superhero novel set in a futuristic, fascist Japan. The short story is Omega Knights, Fire and Lightning, a Power Rangers-inspired prequel to an upcoming serial. Take advantage of this offer today, and be sure to catch Superhero Cinephiles on all major podcast platforms. So the guys head out, right? And then we see them at their apartment, hideout, whatnot, with their leader, Cap, who we see combing his hair like Fonzie, right?
That seemed to be an obsession with him. He seems to really like to comb his hair. So
yeah, it was major Fonzie vibes. I was flashing back to the opening credits of Happy Days, but they talk here. This is where they hatch their plan, right? And we get some more, practical information here, where the Daily Planet has just run the first in a series of 8 articles about this protection racket. The evidence they have is signed affidavits, 50 signed affidavits from shop owners who are being shaken down by the Racketeers.
Right.
And so their idea is to break into the Daily Planet to steal these affidavits. Now, I will say, to the show's credit, because when this was first unfolding, I was saying to myself, all right, if you steal the affidavits, I guess that hinders this larger investigation, but they still have all of the witnesses. They could sign new ones. But there is a line later on from one of the racketeers about, making sure they don't sign them again or something to that effect. Like, that is acknowledged. So I was like, okay, I appreciate that.
It was, oh God, which character was it? It was Spud, who says, after we get these, we're going to make a few trips to some shop owners and make sure that they don't re-sign them.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah. So again, I think that went a long way. I was like, all right, that all tracks. So the idea is to break into the Daily Planet to steal these affidavits, but they acknowledge, well, Superman seems to have a personal interest in the Daily Planet. So essentially, they're not going to do this on Superman's watch. So they need to get rid of Superman. And this is where, you tell me, does this logic track? It seems to be a generally known thing that Clark can get in touch with Superman, right? Even these guys know, like, Clark seemingly is the guy. But then they start to wonder, well, what if Clark is the red herring and really Tony's tall tales are true and he's actually Superman's contact? So this is where they hatch this plan to feed information to Tony in the hopes that we'll get to Superman and send him on this wild goose chase.
A little bit of a leap of logic there. So yeah, I mean, it was definitely a leap of logic to facilitate the plot, but to me, it just seems, they've pretty much established, you're right, through everything that Clark is the man. He's a person that has a contact with Superman. So
yeah. We go with it. We always go with it, but we point it out and then we go with it. So we're back at the diner now. And this is where, talking about the recipes, this is where Tony brings the super burger to George, claims that this was a recipe given to him by Superman. Ace and Spud come back in, second visit, and they ask for a couple of bowls of this super soup. We also get, not that it was such a dark line, but George saying that he thinks Tony has super holes in his head. I was like, whoa, a little rough towards poor Tony. But while the racketeers are sitting there in the booth waiting for their soup, they talk purposely loudly so that they know Tony will hear. They talk about this plot to kidnap Lois Lane by Mr. X around Watsonville tomorrow around 6 p.m. This is what they've heard through the grapevine, and they say it loudly so that they know Tony will hear. And once Tony arrives and gives them their soup, they quickly leave and cross paths with Clark, who then comes and sits down. And this is where Tony talks about needing to get a hold of Superman, which he says is not a problem. But he needs to know where Lois is because she's going to be kidnapped. And this is where you see once again, I think the greatness of the George Reeves performance, where as good-natured and charming as he can be, he also flips, because when Tony mentions this kidnapping, he's like, hey, that's taking a joke too far. Which I love, because it's like, I've humored you long enough, but like, this is too much.
Yeah, he definitely flips his attitude when he thinks Lois is in danger. So I thought that was very interesting as well. Tony obviously then backtracks a little and says, oh no, in case you just happen to run into him first. So I notice Tony never backs down from his claim that he is Superman's best friend.
Yes. So now this is my problem / question. I mean, I guess we are to assume, I guess we are to assume that he knows Clark will get this message to Superman, right? I think we have to assume that. Otherwise, he's really potentially putting Lois in danger, right? Because even through this, he's like, oh, I can get in touch with Superman. But it's like, but you can't. So, I guess we are to assume when he's saying this to Clark, he knows it'll eventually make its way to Superman.
Yeah, that's the impression I got too.
Yeah.
He definitely, he's trying not to like reveal his lack of connection, but he knows that if he says it to Mr. Kent, then the information will get to the right place.
Yeah. Which, of course, the moment he uttered it to Clark, it got to the right place. But Clark asks, again, everyone likes milk here. Clark asks for a glass of milk, but he wants it delivered to this table by the rifle. So he goes back there. He makes sure no one's looking. Got to protect the secret identity. And he takes the gun off the wall and he bends it back into its original proper shape. And when Tony comes over with the milk, he clocks this. And Clark's theory is, well, this must mean that Superman got the message, right? Is it Clark who posits that theory, right? Or is it Tony who gets there first?
No, I think if I remember, I was Clark. You're right.
And then I think Tony says, like, oh, yeah, he's so fast. Like he did it at super speed, essentially. Yeah. But Clark does, again, continuing to humor him, Clark does tell him, like, but keep your eyes and ears open, right? Which, again, I audience, right? I don't mean to like just poke holes in this, but they're questions that I have as I'm watching it. It's natural. Especially I'm watching these twice and taking notes. So it's like, the wheels are turning. I'm like, wait a minute. I feel like the best lead that they have in this episode are Ace and Spud, right? Like that's who Tony overhears this from. It feels like, and they seem to know who these guys are. It feels like Tony gets there later when he records these two guys. But even from this point, I feel like Clark's step would be like, I got to find those guys who just left like a minute ago. They might have more information. But that's not what we get. All right. So from there we have
But
this,
if we do, Anthony, if we do that though, then the story ends at that point though. We've got to milk it for another 15 minutes. So.
But that's why I'm saying I feel like there needed to be like some other turn. I don't have a fic. I don't know exactly. Sometimes I come up with specific things that I would have wanted. I don't know what I would have wanted here per se, but like, I don't know, some other complication. But in any event, from there we get this really long exterior shot of the Daily Planet. And then a very brief scene between Clark and Perry, again, confirming they continue to not know where Lois is and essentially land on this. She probably won't call to tell us where she is. So that seems to be a bit of a dead end there. Yeah. And then we check in once again briefly with our trio of racketeers. They're going to go back to the diner to try to get a read on Tony to see if he delivered the message. They're pretty confident that just from watching him, they'll be able to tell whether or not he was able to get this message to Superman. And then from there, we're back at the diner for our final sequence of the episode here. Before I kind of give my little run, anything else that you want to throw in before we do that?
No, I think we've hit most of the highlights. So,
all right, right on. So back in the diner again, we have this business we talked about before with Jim trying valiantly but failing to ask Elaine out. The racketeers come in. There's an exchange about the rifle because they notice that it's been straightened out, and they ask Tony about it. And it's like, how'd that happen? It's like the same way it got bent in the first place, right? So again, seemingly he's gotten the message to Superman. So Tony, to his credit, this is, I think, the best thing that he does in this episode where he sets up this recorder in the back room near their booth, and he purposely places them at that booth. It's like, oh, best seat in the house. So he puts them there. He sets up the recorder. Right? Kudos to Tony for this. And he sets up the recorder. But then these two numbnuts come in and they want to dance. They want to play music from the jukebox and just and go at it, which I don't know. I'm not from this era. I mean, it's like how normal would this behavior be in that context? I guess specifically.
It did seem a little weirdly out of place. Like here's like this diner near the Daily Planet. People are coming in, and like a couple of teenagers come in and want to dance in the middle of the diner next to the jukebox. It seemed a wee bit contrived, shall we say? So,
yeah, it was wild, but yeah, I don't know, over the top to the point where it becomes humorous, maybe. But Tony tries to stop them. He's like, it's not working, but they're like, no, it looks like it works. And then they start playing music. Then he unplugs it. He's like, oh, it's broken. And then they're like, no, it's just unplugged. So you get all this back and forth. But the complication is that once that music is blasting, that's interfering with the recording, of course.
Right.
And in the midst of all this, Lois shows up. To your point, you never know where she was or the results of her trip, her investigation, but she does show up there. But that doesn't stop the racketeers, right? Because if Superman's on this wild goose chase, the fact that Lois is back, doesn't necessarily put an end to their plan. So they're still waiting, right? Like at 6:00, they're going to go and make their move on the Daily Planet. So we have our ticking clock in the midst of all of this. Tony brings Jim to the back room. I think this is even before Lois arrives. But Tony brings Jim back to listen to the recording and talk about the fact that they don't have a clean recording now because of the music. Jim calls Clark, who's changed into Superman, and he's just pacing back and forth like he's waiting for his go signal, trying to figure out what's going on, where Lois is, trying to put a stop to all of this. And he listens to the recording through the phone. They think they're talking to Clark, of course. And thanks to his super hearing, he's able to hear everything. What's interesting here, though, is that I guess like the first part of the recording is clean. It's before the music started and essentially tells them what they need to know, that there's no kidnapping plot. Like that's the most important piece of information. But I guess they do still need to know what these guys wanted this wild goose chase for.
Right.
And that's the part that's covered by the music that Superman is able to hear.
Right. I like that a lot. I actually love the fact that, we're so used to seeing Superman with his super strength and his speed and flying. It was interesting to see them use the super hearing so in depth for that he could hear through the music what the gangsters were saying. I thought that was really interesting, and I liked it because, it's not something that they use all the time.
I agree. No, I think that was a good use of the super hearing for sure. So he shows up, he intercepts these guys before they leave. He says it's the perfect end to a wild goose chase. So he stops them. Then we get this food fight that we talked about before where Tony, Elaine, George, Jim, all of them, they're just throwing food at these guys. They're slipping and falling, and everybody's having a good laugh. And again, like we said, I don't know, from Tony's perspective, maybe not the wisest move, but like I said, I think, he achieved some catharsis through that. So hopefully it was worth it to him. And then again, in these final moments here, Superman is with the gang. And, like I said before, Tony essentially starts to apologize and Superman very quickly stops him and has a line about, I have another recipe for you. And then it's Jim, I believe, who asks like, well, how did Superman know about this? And Superman's like, well, but you go for it.
Tony says, well, there's some secrets that are just between Superman and myself. And that's so kind of Superman because he's obviously, he doesn't want Tony to feel like he's a liar. He doesn't want him to feel like but he just humors him in the most gentle, like way. And it really talks about this version of Superman and how he reacts to people. It was very nice. I thought it was a very nice touch.
It was. Because again, when Jim says, how did you know? It's, Superman who's first quick to toss it to Tony to say, well, you got to ask Tony. And then, like you said, it's like, some secrets between the two of us. And then again, that final little button from George, who's like, well, I'll be darned. He really does know Super. So now they're not all tall tales, right? Like now he has actually met Superman, which, I think was a very nice payoff for this. Yeah. Again, like this was a fun one. I think I needed a little more meat on the bone, for me this was not a particularly gripping one, but it was a nice, lighter, more humorous one, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. I thought it was interesting that they call it that the name of the diner was The Diner.
Yes.
That was it wasn't Tony's Diner. It was just The Diner.
Well, there's coming up The Boy Who Hated Superman. I think it's that episode where they talk about going to Tony's Diner. We don't see it in that one, but they talk about going to Tony's Diner. Mm-hmm. If I'm not mistaken, but there's just the sign here, just The Diner. So as you might remember from the last time you heard, the final thing we do in these episodes is we rate them on a scale of 1 to 5 fedoras. 5, of course, being the best. So Gene, how many fedoras would you give My Friend Superman?
I'll give it 3. I'll give it 3 fedoras. For the unexpected humor and the being a big fan of the Three Stooges, I was kind of amazed by the pie fight at the end. So,
right on. No, that's totally fair. I'm not that far off. I'm gonna go 2.5. 2.5 for me. Not my favorite, but solid enough and entertaining. So 2.5 for me, and you said 3 for you.
3 for me.
Right on. Well, listen, thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to say before we sign off?
No, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed being here. And it's always a pleasure to, when I was a kid, I really didn't have anybody to talk about this show with. And this is so nice to like sort of do deep dives into these episodes and really, share my love with the series with someone who's also an aficionado. So,
Well, no, it was so great to have you. Always great getting your perspective. So I thank you very much. I thank you, audience. Make sure you come back next week for our next all new episode. And until then, remember, only Superman can do super things. Be sure to check out our sister podcast series, Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey, a weekly exploration of Superman's vast 85-year mythology, available wherever you get podcasts. Please join us on social media, become a patron, and subscribe, rate, and review today. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all. This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too.